Wendy, in the squad room here. Great to continue this conversation. I'm just going to continue with the questions here and let's go for it. This is free flowing. So whatever time it takes, let's do it. So I have a scenario that was submitted to me and I want to almost read it verbatim just so we can kind of get this real picture here and answer this question. So a coworker reports concerning changes in their colleagues' behavior, such as unexplained injuries, appearing frightened when their phone rings, kind of a lot what we talked about, and what appeared to be an aggressive confrontation in the parking lot. When approached by a supervisor, the employee adamantly denies any domestic violence and refuses to discuss it. What should organizations do in this complex situation?
Well, organizations have to create policies regarding what is supposed to be recorded, memorialized, kept, whether it is writing down what somebody saw, whether it's screenshotting emails or looking on social media around the time that they're seeing something that's concerning, like you mentioned in the parking lot. Those are the kinds of policy considerations that many employers have. But let me also tell you a couple of other red flags that may be included within these kinds of observations. Consider that question paired with things that somebody is noticing about victim performance, whether it is diminishing output, appearing distracted, tired, signs of substance abuse, expressions of hopelessness, helplessness. In other words, if these other observations are paired with changes in a victim's behavior, that is sounding more like a constellation of, let's say, circumstantial evidence that there's something going on outside of the workplace. And especially in a day and age where we know workplace violence is important and increasingly important, sadly, as we continue to see some of these incidents escalate, it's increasingly important to know all the different places where we can gather evidence to evaluate the seriousness of a situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hopeful. You know, as I look at all the different organizations I work with, I have seen a move in the direction of responding as well as doing what we can to have a preparedness plan for working with employees more than I think I've ever seen in the past. And it's not there yet. I'm not going to, give it an A+ by any means today, but I see this movement in that direction. We need to keep this conversation going because it is so important. And it's not something new, certainly. While our approach may be evolving today, this has been going on for the eons, and we need to be addressing it. Let's talk for just a minute. We've kind of covered this, but I'm curious, any additional comments on this? So we have victims trying to manage both their work responsibilities and their abuser's behavior simultaneously. How can this kind of dual pressure point manifest in their performance, their behavior? What should the supervisors be looking for? Any of those telltale signs beyond what we've already talked about?
Yeah, when you have that many balls in the air, one is going to fall. You're going to miss a deadline. You're going to have a performance evaluation that is markedly different than it was in the past. Jim, one of the very obvious signs is the emotional presentation of the victim. We've talked about that in terms of all of the sort of warning behaviors. But sometimes it is just that exhaustion and almost sense of just hopelessness on somebody's face. The lack of smiling and laughing and engaging. That is a red flag. That is such an obvious red flag. And the reason it's obvious is because people that know the victim best will see it first. And guess what? That's not going to be a supervisor. If you look at statistically, the way victims end up finally disclosing what's going on at home, it is not up the chain of command. It is laterally. They end up telling the person with the cubicle next to them. The group they often go to lunch with, one of those members may be closer to the victim than others, and he or she will confide in a colleague. I mean, this is the way it happens. And then, of course, the poor colleague is left with the question of, now, what do I do with the information? But these are the ways we can really evaluate domestic violence, or let's just say potential coercive control, because there doesn't need to be any violence for a relationship to be progressing down that road. And those are some of the things we notice. Let me give you a couple more very practical examples, because I know we can read all the literature we want. We can go to threat assessment presentations. We can have a beautiful workplace violence policy, but we're still left with the practical reality. What do I look for and what do I do with the information I see? We've talked about victims presenting differently. Their demeanor's different. They jump when their phone rings. I mean, all of these mean something. What about the victim that comes in with a smashed phone? How did that happen? And then you talk about explanations that don't make sense. Why are they covering for whoever it is they live with or whoever it is they're dating? Why don't enough coworkers, why haven't they met this person? And if they have, guess what? They're the best ones to notice red flags because they haven't traded in their reading glasses for rose-colored glasses. They're objective. It's the same thing when I talk to young women. I always say, introduce your boyfriends to your parents and to your friends. Make sure you integrate them within your social circle because if there are red flags, somebody is going to see and say something.
Absolutely. Hey, you opened a whole nother can of worms in a future segment we're going to talk about, but it's that culture of reporting, right? We as organizations need to develop that culture where people feel comfortable in reporting and there's a system and a process for doing that. Because I see that time and time again when I work with organizations and I get down kind of the nitty gritty and talk to employees and say, so here's the scenario, and it's many times kind of the scenario we just used a moment ago. And I'd throw that out there and you're like, I don't know who I'd report that to, or I guess I'll tell my supervisor. There's just not a clearly defined process or steps that you can take, and many times too, there's that hesitation of like, I don't know if my employer would want to know that, and so I think that's again a whole nother segment. We can spend 20 minutes on that alone. But I think that's an important thing for our viewers as they're listening to this to really think in your organization, are you set up for a culture of reporting? Do people feel comfortable? And is there a process? Here's my big question of the day, though. And I think this is really what our employers need to hear. What are the most critical steps an organization should take in the first 24 hours after learning an employee is experiencing domestic violence?
The first 24 hours are key because that's where you're going to be documenting all of the necessary information while it's fresh in the mind of any witnesses, of the victim, et cetera. But it's also going to be the time that you're going to put safety precautions into place. Now, sometimes that may be a workplace violence restraining order of some kind. Sometimes it is calling law enforcement to the scene to take a report, identifying witnesses, putting a hold on surveillance video footage that may have captured the perpetrator's vehicle, for example, or his or her presence in the parking lot. You're going to want to create a timeline because that is what somebody like me is going to work with in documenting domestic violence or any kind of workplace violence. Maybe it's an angry coworker or ex coworker with a grievance that's showing up at the workplace. But that is, let's call it the golden 24 hours. Sometimes we used to say the golden hour. You may remember the 1 hour that police are documenting right after a domestic violence attack. But if you have the luxury of a longer period of time, not only are you going to make sure you separate the parties when you know who the perpetrator is, but you're also going to want to connect the victim with the service providers that she needs, with the advocacy that she needs. Remember, victim advocates are uniquely trained to minimize the trauma of having to relive or explain a domestic violence incident. As much as we would like to think we are, supervisors are not well trained unless you work with victims all day long. They're not trauma-informed responders most of the time. They're running a company, they're managing personnel. So being able to have those resources accessible, medical treatment if the victim needs it, make sure he or she has a place to stay. I mean, I could go on and on, but you see the gist of what I'm saying is it is immediate help, immediate information, access, and services that are made available to the victim while concurrently securing the victim's safety through securing the workplace, making sure the residence is secured, whatever it is to make that victim safe.
Thank you, as always, to members of the Good Squad and for being here in the squad room. We hope you enjoyed this additional conversation with Wendy, and I'm looking forward to having her back on the show in the very near future. Have a great day, and we'll see you on our next episode.